What would you do if someone looked you up and down and decided you didn't belong? If a uniform that stood for centuries of service was dismissed like a fake badge at a costume shop? Because that's exactly what happened at Heathrow Airport, when a royal guard in silence was denied first-class boarding and chose not to argue but to make one quiet call. What followed didn't just reverse the decision, it shook an entire airline behind closed doors. Now, before we reveal how it all unfolded and why that airline ended up grounding 2 of its own flights, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing just how far these stories reach. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. It was just after 6:30 a.m. when Corporal Hugh Larimore arrived at Heathrow Terminal 5, shoulders square under a black wool coat. His steps measured even in civilian shoes. The overnight flight from Toronto had landed late, and he'd only just cleared customs after accompanying a small ceremonial delegation back from a service at Queen's Park in Ontario. His connecting flight was booked on Britannia Air First Class, Gate B 42. Departure 8:05. He didn't look like a man who'd be flying premium, not to the untrained eye. There was no tailored blazer, no branded carry-on. His shoes were polished, but plainly so. His hair, close cropped and starting to grey at the temples, framed a quiet, weathered face. The only clue, if you knew what to look for, was the silver Scots Guard insignia on his lapel and the worn leather passport holder in his hand, stamped with faded Ministry of Defence markings. He joined the line at the first-class counter, waiting patiently behind a rugby player, loudly discussing sponsorship deals, and a couple in matching designer tracksuits who appeared to be influencers of some sort. Hugh didn't scroll his phone. He simply waited. The check-in counter was manned by a sharp-faced young agent named Callum, whose blonde hair was slicked back, with the kind of precision that suggested he valued control, and possibly himself above all else. His name tag read Duty Supervisor, though the title looked newly printed. Next to him, a trainee in her 20s scanned bags with nervous glances toward her superior, careful not to make a mistake. When Hugh stepped forward and offered his documents, Callum gave them a cursory glance and raised a sceptical brow. "Sir, this is the first-class queue." "Yes," Hugh replied simply. Callum's eyes flicked back to the boarding pass. "You're flying alone?" "Yes." He examined the passport more carefully now, flipping it open and closed. "Did someone book this for you?" "Number I booked it myself." Through the MOD's civilian account, Callum's smile was thin, professional in the way cold water is wet. "We've had some impersonation issues recently. People claiming to be military for upgrades. Do you have any military ID on you?" Hugh pulled out his service card without hesitation. Callum held it like it might be forged, glancing between it and Hugh's face. The pause was long enough to gather attention from the couple behind, who leaned in, watching. "You'll understand we have to be cautious," Callum said, still holding the ID. "A lot of people wear pins and claim associations they don't have." "That's a regimental pin," Hugh replied, calm. "You can verify it with your security team if you like." Callum made no move to do so. Instead, he turned toward the trainee beside him. "Clara, can you call over security? I'd like a second check on this one." Clara hesitated. "Sir, his ticket's valid." "Call them," Callum snapped, already reaching for a form. Hugh said nothing. He stood quietly, eyes steady, hands at his sides, the kind of posture that came from 15 years of standing in silence, while tourists shouted in his face. He had served in Helmand Province, stood vigil at royal funerals, and performed night watches while the country slept peacefully. He was used to being unnoticed, but this was different. "Sir," Callum said again as 2 security personnel approached, "I'm going to need you to step aside. We'll get this sorted." A man in a tailored blazer and loafers was ushered past Hugh with a beaming smile. "Mr. Carraway, welcome aboard as always. Champagne waiting at the gate." Hugh stepped to the side, without resistance, his bag still slung neatly over one shoulder. The security officer asked for additional documents. Hugh complied. They examined everything without urgency, clearly embarrassed. The senior officer, a balding man with kind eyes, spoke quietly. "Sorry, sir. Just doing our part. Protocol and all that." "I understand," Hugh said evenly. Behind him, one of the influencers whispered to the other. "Maybe he's just pretending. Looks like a retired postman." Callum overheard and didn't correct them. When Clara tried to explain that the military ID checked out, Callum waved her off. "It's not just about the ID. First class is for priority passengers, executives, dignitaries, and service members," Clara said quietly. Callum ignored her. "Next time," he said to Hugh with that same cold smile, "you might want to fly economy with the rest of the tourists." The moment lingered. Hugh said nothing, but as the security officers prepared to escort him to an internal checkpoint for further verification, Hugh slowly reached into his coat pocket and tapped a number into his phone. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch, just held the phone to his ear and said 6 words. "Permission to escalate. Immediate clearance requested." The line went quiet. Then a voice answered, calm, crisp, unmistakably military. "Proceed. I'll handle the rest." What happened next would change more than just one man's travel plans. It would shake an entire airline. Corporal Hugh Larimore had always been a man who stayed quiet when others would raise their voices. Not because he lacked words, but because silence, when chosen, was often the sharpest tool in a soldier's kit. He was 37 now, 15 years in the Scots Guards, 2 overseas tours, 1 evacuation under fire. He had marched before monarchs and diplomats, stood motionless through sleet and sweat, and buried more friends than he cared to count. But the core of his discipline had never changed. Hold the line. Don't make it about you. Let your actions carry the weight. That's why, even now, being led down a polished corridor behind the Britannia Air check-in desk by 2 apologetic but visibly uncomfortable security officers, he said nothing. "You're not in trouble," the older one said, glancing back at him. "This is just... well, we've had impersonators. People forge IDs, especially after the coronation." He chuckled nervously, trying to diffuse tension. "Guess everyone wants to be close to the red these days." Hugh didn't respond. He didn't need to. They reached a small side office near the airline's internal operations desk. A narrow room with laminated walls, an old leather chair, and a faint smell of coffee and toner. He was asked to wait there just a moment while they triple-checked his documents. He sat, back straight, coat folded over one knee, passport and ID card placed neatly on the table. Outside the glass door, he could see Callum still at the check-in desk, gesturing to Clara with performative confidence. The kind of man who liked being in charge, until something bigger stepped into the room, which it just had. Because the number Hugh had dialed only minutes before didn't belong to a travel agent or airline liaison. It belonged to Major General Roland Wilton, retired, but still active on special oversight for the household division. Wilton wasn't just brass, he was memory made flesh, the kind of man whose voice could part a room and whose silence could end a conversation. They had met in silence years ago, during a pre-dawn remembrance service at St. George's Chapel. Hugh had stood guard while Wilton delivered a reading. They never spoke until Helmand, where Hugh's unit extracted Wilton's convoy after a local convoy escort broke down. Hugh had been the second man off the vehicle, securing the line while mortars thumped the horizon. Wilton had never forgotten. But Hugh had never used the connection, never even hinted at it, until now. He hadn't been looking for special treatment. He didn't care about upgrades or lounges or warm towels. He could sleep sitting upright in a bus shelter if need be. But the way the young man had spoken to him, not with firm policy, but with that acidic blend of suspicion and superiority. The assumption that he didn't belong, that he was faking something sacred, It wasn't just the insult, it was the precedent. The idea that someone like Callum could decide, on looks alone, who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. Hugh didn't push, but he didn't kneel either. As he waited, a few things began to shift around him, subtle at first. The door opened and a man in a dark blazer entered. His badge didn't say security or customer service. It read, Internal Compliance Officer, Corporate Relations. The man's posture told the story before his mouth did. He stepped inside, closed the door gently behind him and said, Corporal Larimore? Yes, I'm Richard Hale. I handle VIP coordination for Britannia Air's government service clients. First, let me apologise. There's been a mistake. I've just come from a call with your liaison contact, and I want to assure you this is being addressed. I'm aware, Hugh said simply. Richard's jaw tightened, not in defensiveness, but in embarrassment. He looked like a man who had realised too late that something sacred had been mishandled. I've already briefed our senior terminal director. Your flight is being held at the gate to accommodate any adjustment you need. Lounge access is available immediately, or we can arrange a direct escort to the aircraft when you're ready. I'll wait at the gate. Of course. Richard hesitated, then added, and the employee involved. Callum will be placed on temporary leave while we conduct an internal review. Military discrimination protocols, especially regarding decorated service personnel, are not just guidelines in our system, they're legal boundaries. Hugh stood, picked up his coat and slipped it on. I'm not looking to ruin anyone's career. Richard gave a small, respectful nod. With all due respect, Corporal. I think he may have done that himself. As they stepped back into the corridor, Hugh passed Clara, still at her desk, her eyes wide as she watched him walk past, accompanied by corporate security. She gave a small nod, a flicker of silent apology. He returned it with the faintest nod in return. The hallway felt quieter now, not in volume but in tone. A shift had happened. And whether the rest of the passengers understood it or not, the airline most certainly did. Back at the check-in desk, Callum's posture had changed. He was no longer leading. He was being spoken to, quietly but firmly, by a man in a grey suit with an earpiece. The trainee beside him avoided eye contact. As Hugh reached the top of the escalator leading to the departure gates, he paused, turned, and looked just once toward Callum. Not with anger, not with triumph. Just the kind of glance a man gives when he knows exactly who he is and doesn't need to say another word to prove it, because some men don't push, they stand, and when they do, the world eventually moves around them. Back at the Britannia Air Operations Suite, things were no longer running by schedule. Hugh Larimore sat at gate B, 42, legs crossed, coat draped neatly over his arm, a paperback tucked under one hand but not yet opened. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention, yet everything about him, the stillness, the bearing, the perfectly composed silence, seemed to suggest that someone important was nearby. Not everyone had figured it out yet, but upstairs the airline's corporate headquarters had. The first sign of trouble came 15 minutes after Hugh placed the call. Britannia's head of terminal operations received a direct phone line transfer from a government liaison who didn't introduce herself by name, only clearance level. I need you to patch me into your Director of Flight Services. There's been a breach in first-class handling protocol involving a military delegate under protected status. Understood. May I ask which department? Office of Ceremonial Liaison, acting under express directive from the Cabinet Defence Council. The manager sat up straight in his swivel chair. One moment, ma'am. And so began the chain. From flight services to internal security, from internal security to regulatory affairs. From there, a quiet conversation with Civil Aviation Authority compliance officers who, within minutes, issued a standby advisory on Britannia's passenger clearance systems. An informal warning that's one bureaucratic step shy of a public rebuke. All over one man, one guard. Back on the ground floor, Callum's morning began to disassemble in layers. He was pulled aside by the grey-suited compliance officer and escorted to a side corridor. No more smirks, no more feigned authority. He looked like a schoolboy summoned to the headmaster's office, suddenly aware that the teacher he mocked might have been a war hero. "Let me make this clear," said the officer quietly. "You may have just created a PR and compliance event by challenging the identity of a Tier 2 protected service member with diplomatic clearance." Callum blinked. He wasn't in uniform, and he didn't say anything about diplomatic. "He didn't have to," the officer replied coldly. "Do you know what happens when the Crown Liaison Office sends a formal reprimand to an airline over passenger mishandling? We don't just lose a customer, we lose contract access to all ceremonial and state-funded travel." Callum tried to explain. It wasn't discrimination, it was just protocol. He didn't look like military. "You just admitted that to me, on record." Callum's mouth opened, then shut. Across the gate, a woman with a clipboard, part of Britannia's elite concierge team, approached Hugh and offered him a bottle of water, followed by a wrapped refreshment pack. He declined both politely. "Would you like us to prepare a private boarding corridor, sir?" she asked. "No need," he replied. "You'll be the first invited to board, of course." "I'll board with the others." She hesitated. "Of course. Just let us know if anything else is needed." As she left, a father with 2 children leaned over from across the aisle. "You, military?" he asked awkwardly. Hugh nodded but didn't elaborate. "Right," the man said, scratching the back of his neck. "Saw how they treated you at the desk. That was rough." Hugh didn't respond. The man shifted in his seat. "I was Army long time ago. Northern Ireland. Not that it matters now." "It matters," Hugh said quietly. The father nodded once, grateful, then returned to his kids. Meanwhile, upstairs, Major General Roland Wilton had finished his final call. He didn't speak to media. He didn't issue public statements. But he made sure that Britannia Air's Director of Operations received a faxed letter, formal, typed and signed by hand. It was headed with the embossed seal of the Ceremonial Services Office. This individual was not simply a passenger. He was a designated transport liaison for the Scots Guards ceremonial detachment assigned to international dignitary representation. He holds cross-agency clearance, and as of this morning he also holds my full backing. The civilian staff who fail to recognise that will be subject to audit review. If your staff cannot distinguish between disrespect and protocol, they should not be entrusted with either. By the time the plane began boarding, Britannia's internal messaging system had already issued a temporary compliance freeze on all Tier 2 security passengers, effectively pausing new boardings of any official military or diplomatic clearance travellers across 3 international terminals. It was a quiet shutdown. No headlines, no flashing alarms, just a ripple of urgency inside the system. Just enough to remind the airline that some passengers carry more than baggage. They carry entire traditions, entire histories. Down at the gate, Clara, the trainee, walked slowly toward Hugh. She looked hesitant. He looked up politely. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know who you were, but I should have said something. It didn't feel right." "You were the only one who questioned him," Hugh replied. "That means something." "I still should have done more." "You did enough." She paused, then added, "They're suspending him." Hugh gave the faintest nod. "Not my decision. I didn't ask for that." "No," she said, "but you didn't need to. The uniform spoke for itself." "Not today," he said. "Today, it was just a voice." And with that, he opened his book and began to read. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. But one call, one voice, had rippled through an entire airline like a silent trumpet blast, and nothing was going to be quite the same afterward. Long before he ever made that call, before Britannia Air staff scrambled to salvage their dignity and policy manuals, Corporal Hugh Larimore had lived most of his professional life in silence. It was the kind of silence people mistake for passivity, until they understand who it's protecting. Because the red coat Hugh wore on ceremonial duties wasn't just about pageantry or photo ops. It was weight, worn not for display but in memory. Every thread stitched into that scarlet wool carried the blood of past generations. Every polished button, every boot that clicked on parade grounds echoed the footsteps of men who'd stood in that same posture, some of them never coming home. Hugh had learned that early, long before the tours in Helmand and Kandahar hardened his body and dimmed his appetite for noise. His father, a reservist with the Scots Guards, had drilled it into him. We don't raise our voices, we raise our standards. Hugh enlisted at 20. Within 3 years he was leading rotation drills during the changing of the guard, his presence so precise that new recruits tried to match the angle of his chin. He stood outside Windsor Castle during the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. He marched in the rain during the state funeral of Baroness Thatcher. He carried a casket once, when the guard lost one of their own to a training accident, and did so without a blink of emotion, even as the widow wept behind him. But no memory shaped him more than what happened in Helmand Province. It wasn't supposed to be a combat deployment, just a support operation, reinforcement escort duty on the edge of a logistics corridor that had already seen too much action. Their convoy was ambushed 3 miles south of Lashkar Gah. A military transport broke down mid-patrol. Communications cut. Then came the shelling. Hugh's section, already en route to a nearby FOB, intercepted the distress call. Without waiting for direct orders, Hugh rerouted, took the lead vehicle, and drove straight into a zone flagged red by every field report in the past 24 hours. They reached the stranded vehicle under fire, formed a perimeter, and evacuated 3 wounded, including 1 man in civilian attire, later identified as Major General Roland Wilton, embedded for inspection. Hugh never brought it up again. He was awarded a commendation in private. No press, no medal ceremony, just a clasp on his service ribbon and a handwritten note from Wilton himself. So when Wilton received the call from Heathrow that morning, he hadn't needed an explanation. He hadn't asked what happened or why. He simply heard Hugh's voice and moved the machinery. Because the machinery had moved for Hugh once before, and people like Wilton didn't forget. Back at Heathrow, none of that story was visible. Not to Callum, not to the tech bros in their loafers, or the influencers with their vlogs half recorded. All they saw was a quiet man in a black coat, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and a faded service passport. But within that satchel, though no one could see it, was a sealed envelope from the Ministry of Defence, a travel dispatch signed for ceremonial clearance across 6 countries, a stamped order authorising private access to foreign dignitary terminals during international remembrance events. And beneath his shirt, tucked inside a fabric pocket on the lining of his undershirt, Hugh carried a ribbon. The same one Wilton had signed off on, not to be shown, just to be remembered. Because for guardsmen like Hugh, recognition isn't something you ask for. It's something you endure long enough to earn. And when the moment comes to speak, to act, you don't do it for revenge. You do it for every man who stood still before you. By now, Britannia's boardroom had fully shifted into damage control. A full review of their passenger handling hierarchy was underway. An audit team was scheduled to meet with senior compliance officers before the next rotation of international flights. Rumours spread quietly that government transport contracts, worth millions in annual revenue, were under re-evaluation. But on the main floor, the man who had triggered it all was still seated calmly at Gate B 42. Not a hair out of place, not a word raised. A little girl sitting 2 rows away turned to her mother and pointed. "Is that one of the Queen's soldiers?" Her mother lowered her voice. "Yes, love, I think he is." "Why is he sitting with us?" "Because some heroes don't need thrones." Hugh glanced up just once. His eyes met the little girl's. He offered the smallest nod. No smile, just acknowledgement. She beamed, then whispered, "He saw me." To her it was magic. To Hugh it was duty. And upstairs, far from the crowds, far from the gates, a closed-door meeting had just concluded, with Britannia's Director of Compliance scribbling down 4 simple words: never underestimate the quiet ones. Because while most passengers carry luggage, some carry legacy. By the time pre-boarding was announced, Gate B42 looked different. The noise hadn't vanished. There were still toddlers fussing over snack packs and businessmen taking calls on Bluetooth earpieces, but the energy had changed. A low ripple of awareness passed through the waiting area. The kind of shift that didn't require an announcement or a sign, just a shared feeling that someone nearby mattered in a way the average flyer didn't. Passengers watched as a member of Britannia Air's executive response team, distinctive navy blazer, gold pin and tablet clutched tightly, approached the gate desk. She spoke quietly with the agent, pointed once toward Hugh Larimore, and then stepped back to observe. When the boarding call came, first class and special assistance only, a steward stepped forward to escort Hugh personally, but he shook his head. "I'll walk," he said calmly, "like everyone else." The steward hesitated. "Sir, we've arranged—" "I'll walk." And so he did. No fanfare, no flash of ceremony. Just a man standing and moving with deliberate, dignified motion toward the boarding lane, his bag slung easily over one shoulder, coat folded neatly over one arm. Passengers parted for him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Even the rugby star who'd breezed through check-in earlier stood to the side, offering a quiet nod. "My dad served," he said under his breath. "Would have wanted me to say that." Hugh acknowledged him with a glance, nothing more. As he reached the gate scanner, Clara, the trainee agent, stood behind the desk. Her voice wavered slightly as she scanned his pass. "Have a safe flight, sir." His eyes met hers for the briefest moment. "Thank you, and don't forget your instincts. They were right." She blinked, then nodded, a little steadier this time. He moved down the jet bridge alone. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin had been reset with conspicuous care. A manager in uniform stood at the entrance, posture straighter than protocol required. "We've arranged your seat with privacy dividers," he offered. "We also have an open galley if you'd prefer to avoid the cabin during boarding." "I'm fine where I am," Hugh replied. It was only after he stowed his bag and sat that he allowed himself a small exhale. Not exhaustion, just reset. The kind of breath you take after holding steady for too long, after weathering a moment that required your full restraint. Behind him, passengers began to file in. Quietly now. Some recognizing him, others simply sensing something different in the air. Among them, one man walked past, paused, then backtracked. It was the same businessman who had dismissed Hugh earlier in the check-in queue with a passing comment about postmen in lapels. Now, faced with the same man sitting calmly in seat 1A, that passenger offered a nervous half smile and muttered, "Didn't realise you were, someone." Hugh didn't even look at him. He just said, "We're all someone. That's the point." Later, just before takeoff, a cabin crew member slipped him a handwritten card, folded in a crisp rectangle. No branding, just clean white paper. He opened it. "Thank you for how you carried yourself today, not just as a soldier, as a man. We'll do better." Clara. He folded it once, tucked it into his jacket and closed his eyes. Back in the terminal, a manager was quietly removing Callum's badge and logging him out of the check-in desk system. There was no shouting, just quiet HR language and a closed folder marked Escalated Personnel Review. And at Britannia Air's central office, 2 of the airline's scheduled outbound flights, one to Frankfurt, the other to Geneva, had just been flagged for compliance review. Not cancelled, but paused, held until further notice, pending full staff audit and recertification of military and ceremonial passenger protocols. No media would ever report on it. There would be no headlines, no public apology, but internally the message had been received, and it would echo through policy meetings for months. because one man had stood still. And the world had moved around him. The flight cruised at 38,000 feet above the North Atlantic when the seatbelt sign chimed off and the cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. Most passengers leaned back into their private cocoons, scrolling through movies or sipping mineral water handed out in crystal-clear tumblers. But in 1A, Hugh Larimore didn't recline. He sat upright, legs still neatly crossed at the ankle, the handwritten note from Clara resting gently inside the breast pocket of his jacket. He didn't need champagne, didn't need the apology email that had already landed in his inbox, didn't need anyone's sympathy. What he needed, what he'd earned, was acknowledgement. And today, he got it. Not in the form of applause, not through headlines or fanfare, but in the quiet corrections of a system that had misjudged him and now understood the cost. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the co-pilot stepped out briefly to stretch his legs and asked the purser, "Was that the one they nearly removed from boarding?" The purser nodded. "Not anymore." In the forward galley, 2 flight attendants whispered about the escalation, about the internal memo, about the official from MOD who'd issued a request for ceremony protocol retraining, and how Britannia's military contracts would now be reviewed annually by the very office that knew Hugh by name. When the plane finally touched down at Edinburgh, the wheels kissed the tarmac like a bow. At the arrival gate, Hugh stepped out without a fuss. No welcoming party, no waiting chauffeur, just a cool wind brushing across his coat collar and the crisp smell of Scottish air. He passed through the terminal with his usual posture, not stiff, just steady. A man used to moving through the world without needing the world to notice. But today, it had. As he exited toward the long-term car park, a junior staffer from Britannia passed him in the opposite direction. She glanced up, did a double take, and slowed. Then, as they crossed paths, she gave a small nod and said softly, "Thank you for how you stood." Hugh didn't stop, didn't turn. He just replied, "It's what we do." And then he disappeared into the crowd, another man in a dark coat, walking with purpose, carrying nothing more than a weekender bag and a quiet reminder. That real power doesn't shout. It just stands. And when it finally moves, everything else must adjust. Would you have stayed silent like Corporal Larimore, or spoken up the moment that gate agent crossed the line? Have you ever been judged by what you wear, only to prove them wrong without saying a word? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. If this story reminded you that real strength often speaks in silence, give it a like. It truly helps more than you know. Make sure you're subscribed and that bell icon's pressed. We post powerful new Royal Guard stories every single day. And if you know someone who thinks ceremonial uniforms are just for show, share this video. It might change their view of what tradition really protects. Your next story's already waiting on screen. Click it now and we'll see you tomorrow. Same time, same place. Right here.